Hello and welcome to today's lesson on basis of international trade with special emphasis on the theory of comparative cost developed by David Ricardo. In the previous lesson, we learnt about the basis of international trade, particularly on absolute cost difference, which was developed by Adam Smith. According to the theory of absolute advantage, the fundamental base for international trade is absolute cost difference. Absolute cost difference arises when one country can produce a commodity at a lower cost compared to another country. The theory suggests that each country should specialize in the production of goods that it can produce at an absolutely lower cost and export it. Similarly, it imports goods which it produces at a higher cost. Students, before we see the theory of comparative cost, I want you to discuss what will happen according to the theory of absolute cost to trade when one country has an absolute advantage in the production of both goods. Discuss with the student sitting next to you. Students, I hope you've answered the question. Here is the answer. When a situation in which one country has an absolute advantage in both commodities exists, the other country has an absolute disadvantage in the production of both commodities. In this case, trade will not exist. In such cases, we can explain trade better using comparative cost theory because absolute advantage theory fails. Theory of comparative cost is also known as theory of comparative advantage. According to the theory of comparative cost, a country needs to specialize in the production of those goods for which it has lower comparative cost. In other words, a country needs to specialize in the production of those goods it has a greater comparative advantage. Thus, a country produces and exports a product it has comparative advantage and imports a product it has comparative disadvantage. Therefore, both nations can gain from trade by specializing in the production of goods where it has comparative cost advantage. Students, we can easily illustrate the theory of comparative advantage using the following hypothetical example. Watch carefully. Let's take two countries, Ethiopia and Kenya, both producing coffee and tea. The same amount of inputs can produce 24 units of coffee in Ethiopia while it produces 8 units of coffee in Kenya. Again, the same amount of inputs can produce 8 units of tea in Ethiopia and 4 units of tea in Kenya. Students, can trade exist between Ethiopia and Kenya according to absolute cost advantage? Discuss with the student sitting next to you. I hope you've discussed whether or not trade could exist between Ethiopia and Kenya given the hypothetical information. Good. The answer is no. According to the absolute cost theory of Adam Smith, trade cannot exist between Ethiopia and Kenya because Ethiopia has an absolute cost advantage in the production of both goods. However, the theory of comparative cost suggests that trade would exist even in such a situation. Let's see how trade can exist in this situation. First, let's see the relative productivity ratios for coffee and tea, where the relative productivity ratio for coffee is the units of coffee produced in Ethiopia divided by the units of coffee produced in Kenya. That is, it equals to 24 units of coffee produced in Ethiopia divided by 8 units of coffee produced in Kenya. This equals 3. This means per unit cost in the production of coffee in Ethiopia is 3 times less than that of Kenya. The relative productivity ratio for tea is the units of tea produced in Ethiopia divided by the units of coffee produced in Kenya. That is, the relative productivity ratio for tea equals 8 units of tea produced in Ethiopia divided by 4 units of tea produced in Kenya. This equals 2. This means per unit cost in the production of tea in Ethiopia is 2 times less than that of Kenya. Therefore, according to David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, a country that has comparative advantage over a product would produce and export it while it imports the product over which it does not have comparative advantage. In the previous hypothetical case, it will be to the advantage of Ethiopia to specialize in the production of coffee in which it enjoys greater relative efficiency or greater comparative advantage over Kenya. Likewise, Kenya has a comparative advantage or less comparative disadvantage in the production of coffee. Thus, according to the example, Ethiopia should produce and export coffee and Kenya should produce and export tea. Students, let's summarize today's lesson on the basis of international trade, that is the theory of comparative cost. The theory of comparative cost was developed by David Ricardo. We have seen that there are cases in which trade may not exist according to absolute cost theory. For example, according to Adam Smith's theory, trade cannot exist in a situation where one country has an absolute advantage in both commodities. What about the theory of comparative cost theory? Do you think trade is possible when a country has an absolute advantage over the two products? Why? Did you answer the question? Good. The answer is yes, trade is possible in cases where a country has an absolute advantage over the two products. We can explain trade in such cases better using comparative cost theory because absolute advantage theory fails to do so. Students, let me now summarize today's lesson. In today's lesson, we learned that a country needs to specialize in the production of those goods for which it has lower comparative cost according to the theory of comparative cost. Thus, a country produces and exports a product for which it has comparative advantage, and it imports a product it has comparative disadvantage. In such cases, both nations can gain from trade by specializing in the production of goods where they have comparative cost advantage. Students, that's all we have time for. In the next non-plasma lesson, you will examine the concepts, components and impacts of foreign trade. I will see you in our next program. Until then, goodbye teacher, goodbye students.